Last week in the gospel, we were in the garden, and here we are again. But the focus has changed. We're not talking about the planting. We're talking now about seeing what is growing up. This was the year that I finally memorized the phrase, "Leaves of 3, let it be." I finally have that down now. It was my second summer in a row with terrible poison ivy, terrible, maddening, wild poison ivy. And I asked myself, where is this coming from? I love being outside, and I often spend time when I can at Hanacroy Falls and hiking along that New Baltimore area there. And I also have a paddleboard that I keep at a friend's dock at Sleepy Hollow Lake. I thought, have I run into it there? Have I run into it over here? And I was talking with a local Coxsackie gardener who said, I know where you ran into it. It's everywhere around town. It's in all of our gardens. She said, were you weeding around your garage? I said, oh yeah, there were all these plants growing up around the garage. I just ripped them out with my bare hands. Voila. Lots of 3-leaf plants were there. Leaves of 3, let it be. So it's interesting that we hear a story about something similar. The gardener has planted good seed in the field. So why are there all these weeds? Where is it coming from? The same question that I asked. Where is it coming from? And then the question comes, Master, do you want us to tear all this out the way Father Scott did, by force? And maybe now that you've heard my story, you're less surprised to hear that the answer is no. Don't tear it out by force. That won't work. Let it grow together, and we'll deal with it later. This is above your pay grade. Now, why would that be the lesson of this story? Why would the Master say that? My dad has a famous story from his childhood. When he was a kid, in his backyard in Geneva, New York, in the Finger Lakes, he got a terrible case of poison ivy. And it really irked my grandfather, really stuck in his craw, because my dad was an only child, and he said, look at what this horrible plant did to my son. I'm going to take care of that right away. So my grandpa tore it all up, made a big pile, and set it on fire. And he stood right there with a rake and watched it burn and felt very self-satisfied with his arms crossed over his chest saying, take that, poison ivy. Well, you know how that revenge went. A few days later, blisters up his nose, in his sinuses, in his mouth. Everywhere the smoke went, the poison ivy got him. And you know, this lesson tells us that all of the good growth and all of the harmful growth in our life tends to be intertwined. What we are being challenged to do is have the mastery to figure out how to work with what we've got, strengths and weaknesses, gifts and struggles. I guess many of you probably know this. It took me maybe a year or two after I moved here to find out that one of the top-rated restaurants in the world is in our area, right here. If you're surprised to hear me say this, then you probably feel the way I felt when I found it out. It's in Earlton, on a back road. It's been known by different names, but its most famous name is Backyard Bistro. And it's a place you maybe have never been to because you and I couldn't afford it, probably. The chef is a member of this parish, Damon Barrell. And it's been ranked, the last ranking I saw online, the number 7 restaurant in the world. They say that presidents have gone there, flying helicopters into the area and then quietly sneaking up to Earlton. Can you imagine this is going on around us? What makes it so good? We've got a lot of good restaurants in town. What makes that one so good? Well, it's the most unique place you can imagine, because here's what he does. He only uses ingredients, with just a few exceptions, that are from his property, right here in Greene County. But to do that, he has to do some pretty crazy things. Like the vinegar in your salad dressing, he makes by distilling it from the weeds that grow in the pond. The marinade that your beef was in, he used the lichen and the moss from the inside of the rotting bark on the fallen tree. When you go there, there's a multi-course meal, I'm told, and you don't get to choose any of it because you wouldn't know what to ask for. You just have it served to you, and it's among the best things you've ever had. And then he tells you proudly, that came from the swamp right over there. That's a weed from right over here. That wonderful flavor that you have, that came from some shrub that everybody rips out of their yard. People go wild. Critics love it. He was on Good Morning America not too long ago, and dinner there costs upwards of $500 a person. Weeds are used to make everything taste so good. So Jesus is saying to us today, there's a mystery afoot here. You don't want the weeds. None of us want the weeds of life, but there's not much we can do about that. It is, because of a mystery that we won't understand until heaven, part of how this works. And the weeds that we have the struggles with are the ones that come in the form of our weaknesses and our faults and our sins. All of us, when we look at our lives as a garden, have weeds growing all over. And some areas of our garden have a real patch, and others are sprinkled intermittently through the parts of the good crops that we have growing. And this is a really good, clear way to understand what is meant in a practical way by original sin. You know, original sin, the thing we grew up learning about, that's what it means. It means that every person, no matter how good she or he is, has weeds growing in their garden. And the only time that you don't see your own weeds or someone else's weeds, the only time the weeds are hidden is during that little period of time when you're in love. How many people have been married for a few years and one day wake up and say, wait a second, I signed up for this? Where's the dream boat that I married? Where's the person who swept me off my feet? Where's the one who told me there could be no wrong? Well, a lot of that was because they were putting their best foot forward, but an awful lot of that was you were under a spell. You were only seeing the wheat and the tomatoes and all of the beautiful cucumbers and rhubarb that were in the field. You didn't see all the burdocks, but it was there. So we don't know why God designed us this way. We don't know why God designed life this way. Why couldn't God, with all of that divine power, zap away original sin? Well, we don't know that, and we're not going to know this side of heaven, but there are a few things that become clear, especially when we go to confession regularly, when we work on our spiritual life, when we wrestle with these things. We realize that there are some fruits even from the thorny plants. Even the weeds have something to offer us if we become a master chef like Damon Barrell. Here's one of them. The weeds keep us in the garden. You could plant it and forget it like it was some kind of crock pot project. But you can't do that with your life because of the weeds. You have to keep going back to deal with it. And you know how this is. The weeds can overtake the garden. And the people who don't deal with their weeds in life works the same way. It's constant weeding in many forms. Some of our best tools for weeding are confession, and by having a spiritual director or having some spiritual friendships where you can do your work. It keeps us in the garden so that we don't just pretend that we can set it and forget it. Another thing that happens is if we're dealing with our weeds, we are at a much bigger advantage to notice early on when the fruit is getting affected. If we're dealing with the weeds, we can see what needs to be harvested. We can be right there when we realize that little possum paws are grabbing our cherry tomatoes. We can see what needs our attention because we're going to be there dealing with the weeds. And perhaps the most important one, and as I said, when we get beyond the veil, in heaven, I hope God explains it all to us much more clearly, but this one I think you can all know for sure. The weeds keep us humble. Even the best gardener has a garden full of weeds. Even somebody with a pristine lawn might find a patch of poison ivy over behind the garage, because that's how it works. And what happens is the weeds stop us from being so judgmental with others. We don't get the luxury of saying, did you hear that Shirley has poison ivy in her garden? Says the person covered in blisters because they have poison ivy in their garden. So, this is a really important lesson, I think, for us right now. Because one of the things we've heard over and over again is that coronavirus is going to be a marathon, not a sprint. Sometimes you can't believe how long we've been at this already, right? But we're not there yet. We watch the news, we see where the cases are ebbing and flowing. We were the hot spot, now we're not. Now the South has gone wild. We know that we're going to be dealing with this for a while. The problem is we can't rip this out. It's beyond us. We wish we could go and just get our hands around this weed and pull it out, but we can't. It's not that kind of an issue. So what we need to do is keep watering our crops and keep harvesting our fruit and stay real, real humble. Because there's going to be things in your garden you wish weren't there. But my grandpa will be the first to tell you, leaves a 3, let it be.